So welcome everybody. I'm Dr. Costantino Grasso. I'm Assistant Professor of Law at Coventry University, and in my capacity as Principal Investigator of VIRTEU, today I have the honor to welcome you and open this first Roundtable Discussion Session. First of all, please allow me to thank our distinguished guests, Professor Rita de La Feria and Professor Pasquale Pistone, who are amongst the world leading experts in the area of taxation. It is a real honor to have you with us. Thank you also to our VIRTEU national expert for the United Kingdom, Dr. Branislav Hock, for participating in the discussion. I would also like to give a special thank you to our special advisor, Professor Diane Ring, who will share our roundtable sessions. She has not only provided us with valuable guidance on how to enhance the scientific rigor of our research, but has also gone the extra mile to support the project and organize this event. She has been inspiring, and I've personally learned so much from her. She embodies all the qualities that every principal investigator will seek for from a special advisor. The way she has served her role has filled me with deep admiration. Thank you very much for everything, Diane. I would also like to thank the members of our fantastic research team, starting with Dr. Lorenzo Pasculli, who is VIRTEU Co-Investigator, and our two research associates, Mairi Laird and Engin Erkan, as well as Professor Panagiotis Andrikopoulos, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Financial and Corporate Integrity of Coventry University, for his constant support. Last but not least, I would like to thank all the members of the audience who have decided to stay with us today and be part of this fascinating discussion. So let me now briefly illustrate our research project, its aims, and basic methodology. So VIRTEU, that is the acronym for VAT Fraud Interdisciplinary Research on Tax Crimes in the European Union, is a high-profile legal research project funded by the European Union, which aims at exploring the interconnections between tax crimes and corruption, so to unravel the intimate relationships that exist between fraudulent and corrupt practices in the area of taxation. Tax corruption is a subtle, pervasive, and dangerous criminal phenomenon whose dynamics are still obscure and that has not been yet systematically explored. As a result, our research tries to investigate these illicit practices from both a phenomenological and legal perspective, adopting at the same time an interdisciplinary approach aimed at casting light on and propose solutions to counter them. In order to achieve such an ambitious objective, VIRTEU does not rely only on the core research team research efforts, but enjoys the support of a panel of special advisors who are world-leading academics, having extensive expertise in specific areas of knowledge relevant for the project, a group of leading experts who are high-level specialists with established expertise in the functioning of domestic legal systems on which the project focuses, or in areas of knowledge complementary to the ones of the investigators, as well as research associates who are tasked with the analysis of specific research topics that have particular relevance for the purposes of this project. Both the leading experts and research associates will produce technical papers that will be freely available on the VIRTEU website. Moreover, the research team will acquire both quantitative and qualitative data through the production of tailored online questionnaires and gather additional valuable information through this roundtable session, as well as a series of thematic workshops that will be held in next June and July. They will gather high-level legal practitioners and operatives, as well as additional participants from the private sector and the civil society. Finally, all the research outcomes will be disseminated through the organization of a whole-day online international conference that will be held in September, the production of a technical paper tailored to law enforcement officials, and the publication of scientific papers on a journal special issue and an edited collection dedicated to VIRTEU research topics. I will now give the floor to Dr. Lorenzo Pasculli, who is Associate Head of Research at Coventry Law School, Associate of the Center of Financial and Corporate Integrity at Coventry University, and VIRTEU Co-Investigator. Dr. Pasculli will offer a brief introduction of the topic of our roundtable session, which is exploring the interconnections between tax crimes and corruption.
Thank you, Costa, for the kind presentation and from the presentation of all the guests. I really care to join you in thanking Professor Diane Ring, who's been an amazing advisor and also an organizer of the entire Roundtable series. And of course, I want to join you in the thanks to Rita de La Feria, Pasquale Pistone, and Branislav Hock. We make a fantastic panel today, so I really look forward to that. My role is limited here. I just want to express, I know it seems partial on one side, but express a big thank and a big congratulations to Costa for the amazing leadership work that he's doing. I have witnessed how much he works and how hard he works, particularly in this period. I think this really deserves a commendation. Also, as Associate Head of Research at Coventry, it's a pleasure for me to see not only the school, but also the school and the centre collaborating in so many interesting interdisciplinary projects. Now, what I would like to focus on is particularly this latter point, which is the interdisciplinarity. So this is a project which is very ambitious, and it seeks to combine not only black letter legal analysis, but rather an understanding, a broad understanding of how the two phenomena of corruption and tax evasions are interlinked. Indeed, I think that if we browse the names of the participants to the project, me included, you would find so many different expertises, so many different backgrounds, including in our panelists today. And this is the virtue, I think, of our project. So why do I say interdisciplinarity? Why do I say different layers, different levels? Well, there is a main problem that is still understudied. Of course, there are some research going on, literature emerging, but there is the need for some systematization or theorization, is the relationship between corruption and tax crimes as social phenomenon. So from a criminological, social legal perspective. So there are many issues that are emerging from the project already, and I will try to give you a sort of framework, particularly for the audience, because the panelists don't need that, and I would like them to feel free to depart from all the considerations that I'm doing. I'm just providing some structure. So there are some issues that are emerging in the relationship between corruption and tax evasion already at this early stage of the project. First one is a problem of definitions. Interestingly, both tax evasion, tax avoidance, and corruption are extremely difficult terms to define. And there are controversies about the breadth, the scope of these definitions. Even more so, there is a problem of the relationship between the definitions of these terms. In that, according to some interpretations of the word corruption, tax crimes could easily be embedded in this definition of corruption. So there is an interesting relationship that we need to disentangle. So we don't have an answer already, of course, but that's one of the things we need to disentangle. Are tax crimes in general a species of corruption? Do they compenetrate each other? Do they belong to each other? Or they work on separate tracks? The second problem is beyond the definition, is more about the observation of the phenomena, and it relates to the interactions between tax crimes and corruption. One immediate intuition is, of course, that one can be instrumental to the other. Bribery can be instrumental to commit tax evasion or to secure impunity, and so on and so forth, and vice versa. The problem is probably not only this, which is something that we're planning to do through the observation of many case studies and to the many inquiries with the experts, but also another one, which is about systemic corruption. As you've seen in the program of the roundtables, we have a session, the fourth one, dedicated to institutional corruption. So that's something we need to address, because if there is already a problem of definitions, probably this problem betrays a more substantial problem of interactions between corruption and tax evasion, particularly when corruption becomes systemic. So can be tax evasion a manifestation of systemic corruption? Can tax evasion corroborate the systematization of corruption? And this brings me to the next layer of the criminological analysis, which is something that pertains to the traditional domain of criminology, which is the causes. So what are the causes of corruption? So what we're trying to analyze is whether there can be an overlaying framework to interpret the causes of corruption and the causes of tax crimes in one comprehensive analysis. Now, we have already some indications from literature. One distinction, for instance, is between the proximate causes of crime, which are the more familiar theoretical frameworks elaborated by criminology, such as, for instance, motivations, opportunities, and all the various mechanisms of normalization, so rationalization, institutionalization, and socialization. It appears on a first sight that these apply equally to both. So perhaps we do have the theoretical instruments to analyze them, but there's nothing new in that. The real novelty sits in the interpretation of the remote causes of both corruption and tax crimes. Remote causes, we call those phenomena that escape the traditional criminological theory and are much deeper, socioeconomic evolutions, cultural developments, and so on and so forth. These are often addressed in regard to specific situations or offenses. What we aim at looking at is how broad these causes can be and how far can we go in attributing the label of cause to events that perhaps are more societal than related to the crime. So we do have this complex criminological framework that we need to disentangle. The second part of the project, and I move to the conclusions of my intervention, is the responses. So how do we respond? Now, initially, I have to admit, we were facing a rather difficult problem there because, well, it's a huge sea to navigate, the sea of the responses to tax evasion, tax avoidance, and corruption. But again, the literature comes to help, and there are some basic frameworks that some scholars call the global anti-corruption framework, or the global tax crime framework, that help us to find some unity. So some of the common guidelines that we can detect are, first of all, a main distinction between preventive responses and enforcement responses, just to give a systematization. Whereas the enforcement is broader than just prosecution and criminalization and then imprisonment or go to jail, whatever, but includes also whistleblowing, reporting, auditing, internal investigation, internal policing, which is absolutely understudied in certain particular sectors of crime. So we need to try and find a common framework. The initial feel that we have is that there's more in common than we could expect. So initially we said, oh, it's so different, so difficult to combine. Actually, I do believe that there are powerful, particularly socio-legal frameworks that help us to bring everything together. The second level of analysis is not anymore prevention or enforcement, that is the substance, the contents of the instruments, but rather the level of the sources. So the project is in nature comparative, mostly. So we aim at comparing European states. The project is EU funded, and that's the focus of the project. Nevertheless, the analysis cannot stay only on a national level. And from the reports we received already from the research associate and the expert, we already see that it's impossible to talk about tax crime prevention or corruption prevention without looking at the supranational framework, particularly, of course, the EU, but we can also address other regional organizations, and even more so the international framework, because many of the instruments to prevent corruption and prevent tax crimes are rooted in international conventions, which is beyond regions, so to say. Final point will concern the analysis of the differences between regulation and self-regulation. Now, this is a never-ending debate. There is plenty of literature on the point. What we try to find here is how the particular intersections between regulation and self-regulation of the two domains, tax crimes and corruption, can provide a new light on debates that are becoming perhaps a bit old and to an extent a bit stagnant. So there is a need to provide perhaps a new push. One framework is probably, criminologists will be familiar with this, there's the framework of responsibilization or governance instead of regulation. There is a push towards these systems, I would say, in every state, also due to international influences. The point is that there are also many studies that show that these don't work. So what we need to do here is to draw life from the intersections between tax prevention, tax crimes prevention, of course, and corruption prevention, and see whether there can be some new life to these debates or whether we need to move towards more revolutionary frameworks. That said, I think I have given all the structure I could give for these preliminary stages of the project. So the only thing that remains to do is to thank you again. I really appreciate your presence. I look forward to hear all the discussion, and well, good luck with that.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo, for such an interesting presentation and for offering an insightful overview of the relevant criminal phenomena. I definitely agree with you. Of course, the analysis of both the immediate and remote causes of fiscal corruption are part of a common theoretical framework, which makes our research questions and the issues at stake universal across the globe. It's now time to start a roundtable session. I'm honored to give the floor to our special advisor, Professor Diane Ring, who is Associate Dean of Faculty, Professor of Law, and Dr. Thomas Carney Distinguished Scholar at Boston College Law. Professor Diane Ring will be the chair of our roundtable session. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I am delighted to be here and eager to get us all started. So first, I'm going to introduce our panel, just to say briefly a little bit more about them, and then provide an outline of how we're going to proceed for the remainder of the session. So first, we have Professor Rita de La Feria. She is a professor of tax law at the University of Leeds and International Tax Research Fellow at the Oxford University Center for Business Taxation. Also, as you know, Professor Pasquale Pistone, who is an associate professor of tax law at the University of Salerno, and he's also academic chair of the International Bureau of Fiscal Documentation in Amsterdam. And then Dr. Branislav Hock, he is senior lecturer in economic crimes at the University of Portsmouth, and he is VIRTEU's leading expert for the UK. So that is our panel. So how will it work? When we get started, in literally 15 seconds, it's going to be a roundtable discussion. We're not really doing presentations. It's back and forth, really trying to sort of engage with each other and our experiences, our ideas, our research on the topic of tax fraud and corruption. That will run for 40 minutes. At the end of the 40 minutes, we'll turn off the recording and then open it up to questions from those who are attending. Are really eager to hear your perspectives and your questions for us on these issues. During the Q&A, it won't be recorded. And when you have your questions and we turn to you, you can ask them. We'll turn on the audio for you and you can feel free to speak. I would encourage you, members of the audience, to write down your questions as they occur to you. And in fact, you can write them down even briefly in the chat so that I can organize and know sort of who we have in line and who to call on. Also, when we do get to you to ask your question, if you could give us your name, your affiliation, and whether or not you are participating in the VIRTEU project, that would be great. After the Q&A, which will run for approximately 30 minutes, we'll turn the recording back on as we shift to a brief summation at the end from Marie Laird, who will be providing that for us. So that is our plan for the session. And so with that in mind, I think we're ready to start. I thought it would be great to get us going with a basic question, right? And so I wanted to ask our panelists, if you could share with us from your own experience, where you have seen the connection between tax fraud and corruption. Because that's really sort of what we're focused on in this session, the connection between them. And so I'll just sort of open it up, whoever would like to go first.
Yeah, I would like to start. Thank you very much. I'm really honored to be here today. And when I start first thinking about the connection between corruption and tax frauds, I thought about it in two ways. The first is it goes in line with what Lorenzo was speaking about, and I understand corruption in first context as certain framework that can say something about tax frauds, that can say something about outcomes of the systems that we have, and can help us to either analyze them or to assess them normatively. So in this context, corruption is not really an act or crime. It's rather a way to look at whether certain systems are fair, inclusive, how the power is distributed in those systems. And I think there's a lot of many opportunities how to say something useful about what should be tax evasion, what is acceptable level of tax planning. So I give one example. There's a very useful and great paper by Belitska who gives example that UK tax returns of foreign multinationals are half of comparable domestic companies, for example, or that in UK profit shifting, more than half of foreign multinationals report zero taxable income, so that they just don't pay taxes. So while you can get there through legal means, as an outcome, you can really ask through these anti-corruption studies and this corruption-related framework whether this is an outcome that is fair, equal, and how the powers in the society are distributed. If I would suggest one framework which I found very useful, and this is in a way detached from criminology and economic crime studies, let's say, but I found it very useful and what we could explore a bit more is Acemoglu and Robinson, for example, writing about inclusive economic and political institutions and explaining why some states were successful in Asian, in Asian Greece and so on, but why other states failed, for example. And it was because some just simply have developed inclusive political and economic institutions and others did not, and they were not so successful. So perhaps it could be some perspective on what should and should not be appropriate level of tax planning, or what should be tax evasion, or what should be only tax avoidance. So this is just my first meta view on how I would see that connection theoretically. The second, and I leave the floor to my colleagues here, what they think. The second, and I will not elaborate too much on that, would be this really concrete substantive overlaps in between concrete offenses in which are more types of crime present. So bribery includes as well tax frauds, and it as well may include money laundering, but maybe we can speak about it a bit later.
Yeah, may I perhaps follow up?
Go ahead.
Yes. Diane, thanks very much to you and Costa for involving me in this interesting initiative. I must say that I'm very positively impressed by the fact that in the past 3 months, this is the second invitation I get from the University of Coventry, both on tax and crime. And at the last time, it was absolutely interesting for me, and I learned a lot. And I know that today I will learn more. And the format of the roundtable is particularly suitable for that. Now, when listening to what Branislav has mentioned, I was, quite surprised by when I compared what he indicated as corruption from what I feel that corruption can be about. I just want to make things very clear. I understand nothing about corruption. My background is European and international tax law. I like VAT, but I'm not as an expert as Rita is. And I just want to make things clear. So I may be wrong about this, but I was quite sure that there would be a need for a terminological and conceptual discussion at the very beginning. So I'll try to focus on this. And Branislav, this is also why it's important to be together and also to have this interdisciplinary approach to issues of common relevance. So I had felt that corruption would be about the dishonest conduct of public officers for personal gains, which could lead to bribery in violation of their obligation. And when I came out with what maybe this is too much based on my legal studies back in the other millennium in Italy on criminal law. But when I thought about corruption, I also felt the need to bring together with corruption a related phenomenon, which is not entirely the same. And perhaps in Italy, when I was educated to law, it's not described as I normally perceived it to be at the international level, which is collusion. So collusion is not necessarily, in my view, not necessarily the same of corruption. And I think that in the idea of collusion, there should be some kind of conspiracy against a third party. I felt the need to mention that because normally we have collusion to conspire against a competitor, but in tax matters, competitors cannot just be multinational enterprises, and indeed they are competitors, but also states. So I felt that this was somehow, for me important to say what I perceive to be corruption and this related phenomenon. But now let me go into things which I'm more familiar with, which is, the whole constellation of, failure to pay taxes when you are supposed to. And we, and Rita will clearly agree with me, we don't use tax avoidance and evasion as synonyms. Tax avoidance is a circumvention, and I'm sure that, even if Diane is not from Europe, this is quite common across the globe in the tax law community. Tax avoidance is about circumvention of the liability to tax, and it's not an open violation, but it's not tolerated by the systems which adopt mechanism to avoid that undue taxes, are not, that people get unintended advantages from the failure to related to circumvention liability to pay tax. And companies, multinational enterprises, have certainly exploited that a lot in the framework of base erosion and profit shifting and related phenomena. Surprisingly, this has now found a global dimension. Why do I say surprisingly? Because if I look at more serious phenomena, such as tax evasion and tax fraud, then here I am not so sure that we have such a global framework. And of course, for us, as Diane and Rita can say in the tax law community, we are absolutely sure that tax evasion is worse than tax avoidance. They're all bad, but tax evasion is worse because it's an open violation of the rules, and tax fraud, it's even worse. It's a particularly serious, that's how I conceive it, particularly serious form of tax evasion in which the taxpayer engages in conducts that willfully and internationally and intentionally falsify information. Now, we are focusing on VAT, and as I said, Rita is a VAT specialist. I like VAT, but I'm not as good as she is. But the point is that I want to say my perception, and Rita can, of course, correct me if I'm wrong, my perception is that not even in the EU we are able to counter tax fraud properly. So, number one, I am frustrated because we cannot counter tax evasion at the global level properly. I see that in the criminal law community, also with extraterritorial enforcement and extraterritorial prosecution of crimes, they can do that. They have instruments to fight against money laundering, but for many years, they have not been applicable to tax matters. So we don't have an effective framework to counter those phenomena, which are very important for virtue, and it's here where we, with this interdisciplinary approach, should focus. And I think, this is a way to talk to each other and to understand that, we mean different things behind different words, and even if we're all lawyers. And I think, these are important points if we want to achieve what can be desirable, and which is an integrated reaction to tax fraud and corruption, because many times they come together. And in tax matters, there can be situations in which the phenomenon which I have indicated as collusion can go to the detriment of another country, even inside the European Union. Or earlier this week, I was presenting at the European Parliament on the issues related to the EU-UK free trade agreement. There can be issues of competition that can go in a very bad direction, and perhaps also leading to raise a problem of a conspiracy against a competing state. Diane, I feel I have been a little bit too long, but I hope you and Rita will forgive me for that.
I'm taking furious notes. I absolutely do. You just follow up.
Yeah, hi. So again, like Branislav and Pasquale, just to thank the organizers, to Diane and Costa for inviting me. I have placed an embargo on any new work commitments in general, because online teaching plus homeschooling is a terrible combination. But this topic was just so close to my heart. I do care a lot about these issues of tax fraud. I think this link between tax law and criminology and criminal justice has been understudied so far. I think there's a lot of potential for research breakthroughs in this area, so I was very keen to participate. Going back to Diane's question on this, I have to say that the question for me, the way I frame the answer to that question is from the perspective of actors. What are the links from an actor's perspective between tax fraud and corruption? And I think that there is like three key levels of links between actors. The first is the perpetrators, right? And Pasquale and Branislav have already mentioned this issue of the perpetrators, and I have to side with Pasquale on this. There's a clear difference between avoidance and fraud, and we're not, I don't know any multinational that has been involved in serious tax fraud, but I do know many that have been caught on on avoidance. So there is a clear difference between the two, and I think that we have to think about the perpetrators. Who are these people that we're talking about? And when we talk about tax fraud, we're really talking about primarily individuals and small and medium-sized enterprises. This is what we know from the evidence that has started to be compiled by tax administrations about the type of perpetrators, right? And when we look at the leaks that we had with the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, and even them, I know that not everyone will be familiar, but the Luanda leaks for me had a huge impact, because you could see the clear links between the perpetrators of tax fraud and corruption at an institutional level that ultimately led in Angola to the demise of the regime that had been in place for 40 years. So first of all, this kind of clear link in the perpetrators that you can see from media leaks more recently, but we all kind of suspected that was the case for a long time, right? The second link is on the facilitators, and I think Lorenzo mentioned this just briefly, the issue of who is actually facilitating this tax fraud, right? Because it is unthinkable for me that a criminal organization will know so much about VAT they can do carousel fraud. So it's not them. There's someone else telling them what to do, how to actually commit missing trader fraud and carousel fraud. So we have to, there has been work on tax avoidance and professional advice. Oxford started doing that back in 2007 in a project led by Judith Friedman, but also with Jeffrey Loomer and John Vella participating on it. And since then, there has been some studies on the avoidance side and how professionals see avoidance. But there hasn't been any studies on fraud. And the truth is, it's inconceivable to me that they are not involved, that there is not accountants, that is not lawyers actually facilitating tax fraud. Now, again, going back to the Luanda leaks, we had just an inkling of how the government in Angola was hiding money helped by tax firms in that process. So we had just a link to it, but I think this needs some conceptualization about the facilitators. The final point and the final link in terms of our actors for me is the public opinion and the general public. And the truth is that corruption has a massive impact on tax morale that influences then small crime, not serious, the big organized crime, but the everyday tax crime. So the more you see corruption, the more likely you are to not wanting to pay taxes, to feel that you shouldn't pay. Why should I pay when that money goes all to these corrupt politicians, etc.? So I think that's the kind of third link in terms of actors, is really about the link between corruption and morale, which we know about this, but I think that when we conceptualize corruption and tax fraud, we often forget this kind of indirect impact that tax morale has on the propagation, the spread of the tax fraud phenomenon. And I guess that's it. So those were the points I wanted to make to start. Thanks.
It's funny. I was serious when I was taking notes, because there's so many different threads and really important points running through here. I think I want to come back in some ways to where Branislav started, because it resonates with me when I'm thinking about both what you, Rita, were just saying and Pasquale a moment before, which is in some ways, I think, Branislav, you were particularly sort of drawn to asking sort of how does the potential for anything more than a little bit of corruption, the single one-off bad actor, but something a little more systemic, a little more important to the country. I mean, if you have just one instance happening once, we're not going to have the sort of cascading effect that we described. It's really when you start to see it being a more pervasive problem of corruption, sort of what is it that's going on in society? What is it that's sort of in the backdrop? Is it collusion? Beyond those engaging in actual corruption, what kind of other relationships or tacit approvals or acceptance is sort of behind the scenes? And so I guess that kind of leads me to, and I have some guesses as to where you all might go with this, but I thought I'd ask it, which is, with this sort of delineation we've been making between sort of tax fraud and everything else, or tax fraud, focused on that, and corruption, what seem to be the biggest drivers where we're seeing that happen more than just an ad hoc or one-off, problem actor in government? If we're trying to start to think about what the causes, what the sources are, where it's a bit more systemic, what's your sense? Where would you start looking?
Maybe I will react. Thank you for this question, and as well my colleagues for their important views on. I recognize. Maybe I will just first relate it to the discussion about definitions. I agree this is very important. Simply, my point was, you can take a theory to explain some systemic problems, but then we can have a more legalistic doctrinal discussion about, or criminological discussion, what these crimes actually include. So maybe I will raise just one note there, and I would be as well interested in as it relates to the definitional discussion. So when a company pays a bribe, for example, was mentioned, it's mainly about individuals. So let's say we pay a bribe as typical example form of corruption, let's say. And if I pay a bribe as a manager, for example, on behalf of a corporation, then I need to probably attempt to make such a bribe appear as a legitimate business expense, let's say. If I do that, it will kind of translate my books and records, and ultimately I will commit a certain form of tax fraud, let's say, or tax evasion, because I will simply not pay taxes that I should have paid. So maybe this would be just an example whether we can kind of find some more, we can get to some layer of kind of corporate crime and crimes that are actually very explicitly committed by corporations as perpetrators. When it comes to these drivers, which is the original question, I think from my perspective, I can offer a number of theories that can more easily explain individual behavior around rationalization, rational choice theory, or opportunity, which kind of I would assume everybody would have like a first in their mind that, it's just like I play according to rules But if I don't see a sanction, I'm going to kind of increase my gains by going beyond what is perhaps acceptable or legal. If we look more in multinationals and their behavior, I think there we can really explore things around differential association and whether such behavior can be learned, whether it can be justified through some cultures that are emerging within an organization, for example. Another can be we can look at the motivations of managers or internal competition within multinationals that you kind of you have in a position of like certain strain on anomy that you are expected to achieve, but you don't have means to achieve. Therefore, you are helping yourself through certain gray zone tactics or even criminal activities. So this I would be we can be exploring this. We recently wrote a paper or a chapter on corrupt pathogens within corporations, where you have, especially it applies to bribery, for example, when you see corrupt pathogens who are actually seeking for opportunities, you have then more, let's say, not active pathogens that are just kind of approving the behavior or being manipulated, and then you have some residual pathogens that are problems within organization. This relates more to corporate compliance, let's say, issues. So these are just ideas that I'm putting out there when you tell me some about drivers.
I have something, Diane, if I may.
Yes, please.
And I think that there are some fields of business which are simply completely, flooded with tax fraud. So that can be related to, some small and medium enterprises which are in the, let's say, computer selling business or other fields in which we have seen that if you don't get engaged into these type of practices, then you're out of the market. So it is perhaps from a business perspective, I'm sorry if I'm using this this type of language, but from a business perspective, it can be easier and cheaper to bribe the tax officials that audit your company rather than being completely out of the market. So these are very bad, vicious circles which completely dump the market. And in fact, we have to understand that the likelihood of this situation to happen in the European Union is unfortunately also fueled by the inability of the legislator, as we call it in civil law countries, of finding proper solutions to address existing problems. The EU VAT tax has opened up, enormous holes and made it much easier to conduct or to get engaged in this type of fraudulent schemes. So I think that this vicious circle is also, I don't want to say that we just blame it on the small and medium enterprises that try to stay within the market. We should also clearly state that the failure to address the clearly existing problems are also contributing to exacerbate this problem. And at the end of the day, as I said, unfortunately, and I don't want to sort of give a sort of, I don't want to sort of show willingness to accept what small and medium enterprises do. But then, for them, the cheapest way out of that is to bribe the officials during the audit. And I saw that Marilena Ene from Romania in the chat, she was making reference to some kind of issue involving the tax warehouses and something in which Romanian tax officials were involved. So I think it's really important that we see the link, we identify the cause, and we don't just blame it on business. And I also think it could be useful to I think Oliver Charles indicated some points concerning the risk that would arise from blurring the edges of tax avoidance. I think that we should clearly state the protection of the rule of law. Tax avoidance is one thing, tax evasion is another thing, and a particularly serious form of tax fraud is yet another thing. However, I think that we should find suitable answers to each of those problems, and otherwise if we tolerate them, or if we are unable to find solutions, then it's also our fault. The former president of the European Commission, Juncker, at a certain moment before the end of his mandate in January of 2019, has indicated the importance to move to qualified majority voting and to change from the special to the ordinary legislative procedure in the European Union in areas, including VAT at a certain moment, where we know that there are problems. And those problems include tax fraud. And those problems can't be addressed at the interpretative level. The Court of Justice has tried to stretch its case law on that, but then eventually it has realized that the involvement of people in good faith who should have known or reasonably known about the existence of this fraudulent scheme has brought to some extreme consequences in cases like Vetch and Glencore. So I think it's quite important, if we want to break this vicious circle between tax fraud, corruption, and what is easier to cope with, I think that we should start by pushing forward measures that seriously and effectively approach this phenomenon. In the European Union, we are using money of the European Union. In the European Union, this is clearly one example. I'm saying we are using money of the European Union for this seminar. Not that we are using money of the European Union. Sorry, I just want things to be clear because we are recording.
Right, shall I go, Diane? Yeah, so, okay, so I see two problems. One of them is connected to what Pasquale was just saying about the legislation. The other is a kind of a more side point. I think Branislav just touched upon it about the issue of the enforcers. So starting with the design problem, I think that there is a general lack of acknowledgement of what I call the tax policy administration symbiosis. The two are interlinked. And we have started adopting this approach that is not just VAT, not just fraud, but is a general systemic problem, which is we think that we can attack the symptoms without addressing the causes. So we approve anti-fraud legislation, we approve anti-avoidance legislation, and in the hope, fingers crossed, that things are going to work out. And the truth is that unless you will actually address the causes of the legislative causes, I'm not talking about the motivations, because in tax, from a criminological perspective, there is a bunch of motivation, but in tax it's really about money, right? So I'm not talking really about the motivation, but just the opportunity. And the opportunity arises from flawed legislation. But we think somehow that if we just approve one more anti-avoidance measure or one more anti-fraud measure, that somehow we're going to resolve the problem. And this is just not the way to go. So we need to start by accepting that tax policy has a massive impact on compliance. That we need to start accepting that the design of the tax has an impact. And now I'm going to go into a criminological side, but we need to start adopting a kind of situational crime prevention approach to tax law, which we haven't, because basically tax lawyers don't talk to criminologists and to criminal justice experts, right? Because if we did, we would know that situational crime prevention is the way to go with tax law. You design a tax that minimizes the potential for fraud. Now, fraud will never disappear, right? But if you design a tax that shows less propensity to fraud will decrease. So for me, this issue of the tax policy and legal design is critical to why we see fraud the way we do. And we need to basically to start accepting that this is the case, and not just, in essence, try to address that symptoms that we witness afterwards. So that's first point. Second point, I think, is the issue of the enforcers. And we have to acknowledge that the way we structure our tax administrations and the incentives we give to enforcers sometimes undermines the enforcement. And Pasquale just mentioned the issue of the third-party liability, which is critical in VAT, which goes back to Lorenzo's initial intervention of responsibilization. So this is an instance of responsibilization from a criminological perspective of private citizens for crime committed by fraudsters, right? So you're being blamed by a crime that has been committed by someone else, often in another country. There is also an issue of double penalties. We see instances of one crime being blamed on two different people. So it's a quite, from a criminological perspective, this is quite a big step we have given with responsibilization of third parties and VAT fraud. But there is a kind of a bigger issue, which is we give the incentives to tax administration to maximize revenue collection. We tell them that, this is the way to go. And in essence, what we know is that people act on the incentives they are given. I'll just mention a small example. There is a recent study, an empirical study done with the Pakistani data that indicates that corruption increased once they offered auditors a bonus. And the bonus wasn't even financial. The bonus was to basically be able to choose the location of your office, to choose what region of Pakistan you wanted to be in. And that was enough to increase, in essence, what the economists assess to be the bargaining power of the inspectors, and therefore you see instances of increase in corruption. So we have to just think about how enforcement is done. What incentives are we given to tax administrations? Because if we give them certain incentives, it can backfire on the levels of compliance. We have to start ensuring that the law is applied in a kind of a non-selective way, applied to everyone. Just not. I do a lot of work on law and economics, but I sometimes am fearful of the supremacy of the cost-benefit analysis, and on enforcement, it's very tricky to say, oh, if we get more revenue, it's worth to go after someone. But if we don't get revenue, maybe we just let it be, because that in itself corrupts the system. So, to go back to your question, I think that there is two critical issues that we have to think about. One is the design, tax law design, and how that impacts on levels of fraud. The other is how we structure and what incentives we give to enforcement. And think about whether we are giving the right incentives for the right type of enforcement that we want to see. Thanks.
I had a number of thoughts I wanted to sort of get all of your perspective on, but we're kind of coming a little bit to the close of this portion of the panel. But I did want to ask one more question before turning to our final one, which is to sort of think about recommendations. And Rita, you're already really pointing us towards some that you highlight. But I just wanted to throw out there, we talked quite a bit about the motivations and the behavior of the sort of taxpayers. We talked a bit about the government. But in between, you all had also mentioned, Rita in particular, you did, the professionals, the tax lawyers, the tax accountants, et cetera. In some literature, I think you referred to them as the enablers. What do you see as sort of, how, policymakers should approach the role of that group in this process? Are there particular, sort of either recommendations or actions, or, the tax law redesign, for example, might help get at that because you give them fewer tools to work with. But I was just curious whether or not you thought there was anything additional that should be focused in terms of that set of players.
So maybe I'll just go first on this one, just because it was something I mentioned, right? So I want to just, I don't know that there are. So I think the answer to your question is, first we need to know if this is the case. And the problem for me is that at this moment in time, we actually don't know. I suspect they are, because I cannot believe that some organized crime group knows enough about VAT returns and the rules of the VAT system in Europe to actually take advantage of carousel fraud. But we don't know. So I think the first step at this moment in time is to actually understand the phenomenon, even before we design tools to address the phenomenon. We have to understand who are these people that are involved. So I'm currently watching Better Call Saul, the TV series, right? And it actually, that springs to mind in the sense of who are these people, right? So if you knew the character Saul Goodman, you're introduced to Saul Goodman as already a lawyer for criminal groups, right? And the series that I'm watching now is how does he actually get involved with these people? So I would, at this moment in time, my recommendation would not be for a solution, but for understanding the phenomenon. I would just like to know, who are these people? Who is involved? And how are they doing it? How are they even recruited, right? So I would just like to understand the phenomenon more, and I would just encourage tax administrations to understand what is going on before even you approve anything like a penalties or some kind of a punishment. Just understand what is going on, which I don't think we do at this moment in time. So,
Diane, may I?
Please.
Yes, I agree with Rita. Before doing things, it's important to understand, how this develops and where it comes from. I would like to add two more points to this. And I have seen that there is a growing trend concerning the reporting obligations of the intermediaries. And the UK is certainly a master on this with DOTAs and the reporting obligations, then pretty much in case of schemes tainted of tax avoidance, so at a much less serious level than tax fraud. And I want to make the point that by exponentially increasing the reporting obligations, we do not necessarily do a good thing. I am advising a group of research in Antwerp, Belgium, that is doing research on tax law and digitalization. And that is not about the digital economy, but also about the use of artificial intelligence to detect things which are either odd or where there is a higher risk calculated also by algorithms. Then to find out particularly unusual and also likelihood of tax fraud. So I think that to the extent that over the past few years we have tremendously increased transparency, then we can use all this available information worldwide to be processed by artificial intelligence and then try to understand where it makes sense to concentrate the action. I, as you may have realized, I am against an overburdening of intermediaries because it also creates a legal uncertainty. Sometimes you have one person who is, who has knowledge of one step of a specific transaction or chain of transactions, and then that person doesn't have the full picture. And then that person feels obliged to report because otherwise, that person may want to be carved out from the group of enablers and say, well, I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. But then this also creates a chain reaction because perhaps that person also acting in good faith has been reporting something which is perhaps okay and creates additional burden for other people to exercise their rights. So I think that because we have, reporting obligations for business, we should use that information, which is now available worldwide. We should make use of mutual assistance. and to the extent that is possible, use artificial intelligence, not overburden intermediaries, but certainly go down tough in the cases where there are big problems. And here I also want to stress one point, and this is perhaps something also to prompt you, or perhaps I have noticed that we have the pleasure of having also Leandra from the US, and it's not that I want to force Leandra to intervene in the Q&A if we have one, but of course, you know, this is using money of the European Union to bring us together, but it's also should be interesting at the global level. I see that to some extent, when we are not really able to either enforce some rules, we create abnormal situation. One of these is the excessive burden on the intermediaries, and I have already said enough, at least to explain what my view is. And as you can imagine, I'm not a fan of DAC 6 in the European Union, and Philip Baker and I, we do research on taxpayers' rights, and we think that also intermediaries have those fundamental rights. But my point here is about the importance of having targeted sanctions, criminal sanctions, which do not go beyond what is strictly needed to counter a phenomenon. So stronger sanctions for stronger violations. But again, as Rita indicated at the beginning, we should know what we have to do, where it's appropriate to act. And I have sometimes the impression that in some places there are sanctions which are more looking at being deterrent rather than being proportionate. Proportionate doesn't mean just being, not stricter than they're needed for being effective, but also, able to achieve their goal. And sometimes I have the impression that, in other parts of the world, maybe I'm mistaken about the US, but then you do have the deterrent function takes over when reacting to phenomena which are undesirable. And I still think that perhaps this is important. If you know what is problematic, then you go spot on what is problematic. You try to have reaction. You try not to overburden everyone. You don't criminalize many things, as it has happened in Europe in the past, including in my country, which I consider still to be Italy. So it's, I think these are things which are important. So even when we target tax fraud, we have to target it, not just to go beyond that. And somehow, I think that deterrence of sanction goes beyond what's needed for their effectiveness.
So I'm still tempted. I think it's worth hearing your responses just briefly to this question, because we've identified, and clearly there are many problems, right? From tax avoidance, tax evasion, but we've really sort of, I thought, through our discussion today, helped see how important it is to think about, at least as our first cut look at this, tax fraud and corruption, and those, and sort of as sort of a somewhat tightly understood, and I think Pasquale, you were pushing us there early, a tightly understood phenomenon. If we're asking policymakers to respond, respond in a more immediate fashion, we might also be interested in asking ourselves bigger picture questions about society and how what other forces are at work. But if we're asking about corruption and tax fraud, I think that the question I want to leave us with formally as we close this out is, if you were speaking to sincere policymakers in the EU, in the United States, in any jurisdiction that came to you, and they said, we are interested in trying to address the twin and interconnected issues of tax fraud and tax and corruption in our country, what would be your initial strategies or steps to suggest to them?
I could go again, but I think it would not be fair as towards Branislav, because we have been speaking, Rita and I, first. So if Branislav is willing to go first, otherwise I can. Please go ahead. Okay, thank you for your generosity. I think that if we have achieved in the tax community a common approach to base erosion and profit shifting, which is important, then we should also try to achieve a global framework for reacting to tax fraud and corruption and money laundering and bringing them all together, it doesn't make sense to have monads or groups of specialized people which are specialized in one of these three fields and do not interact with each other. So, I think that one of the purposes of the group that VIRTEU is, then I think that this is one of the takeaways and something important to advise for the future. So understanding the phenomena and having a sort of combined interdisciplinary reaction to this at the global level.
Pascal, thank you so much. If I may, I absolutely agree, and I want to just speak about it as well. I think I call it substantive fragmentation. So I think there is a lot of capacity that exists in separate fields, either in certain types of tax enforcement or anti-corruption, anti-bribery enforcement or anti-money laundering enforcement. But not only transnational, but even domestically, these specific authorities that are dealing with these problems are not often cooperating enough and talking to each other, despite the fact that there are some not only institutional overlaps, but as well certain, let's say, enforcement overlaps in terms of mechanisms that we have. So we don't need to use DPAs and negotiated settlements only against corrupt corporates, but we can use it in as well different types of crimes. But what I wanted to say is that giving example of bribery, as I said at the beginning, if you bribe, you likely as well commit tax fraud. And in US, you're going to be enforcing it often. FCPA includes books and records charges, not only anti-bribery charges. So it's more natural perhaps than in some European countries to kind of go together and see one problem as a problem that where different types of crimes overlap: money laundering, tax frauds, and bribery. And once you realize these overlaps, you understand these overlaps, you can save a lot of money, you can be much more effective, efficient. For example, in the UK, OECD is repeatedly criticizing HMRC for not, on the one hand, following so effectively on enforcement of, for example, serious fraud office in bribery cases, because these bribers, if they are big bribers, they will have many tax issues as well. If they bribed $100 million, for example, there are going to be taxes to be paid back. On the other hand, when tax enforcers are investigating their cases, they can already understand and see patterns that certain types of tax evasion or tax fraud, for example, are associated with more serious problems or other serious problems such as money laundering and bribery. So that the detection through activities, so you kind of focus on tax, but if you would be a little bit looking more broader, you would see many things that your colleagues cannot see from their perspective when they are looking for money laundering, for example. So I think this is absolutely crucial, and that would be first thing I would recommend to policymakers. Second and last thing I want to mention is, and it goes in line as well with the Rita that was mentioning situational crime prevention, and I cannot agree more there. This understanding this. And as well a reaction to tax design of these things. But I think one thing we didn't discuss is, and it's that principle-based approach to policing, let's say. So not only should not speak only rule-based approach in criminal law, but more principle-based. That when the regulators say what they want to achieve, you should prevent bribery, you should prevent facilitation of tax evasion, and do it however you want to do it. And if there is a problem, you're going to have a look whether you did enough. So that privatization of enforcement, I think this is as well a huge issue, and how private and public actors kind of co-regulate and co-enforce, and whether it's the right way, whether it goes in the right direction. And I know Rita has an amazing paper on that, tax law and selective law enforcement, and that's a really, really great paper.
Well, thank you. I'm going to take that comment and take advantage of the fact that you mentioned my paper to just add a final comment. In addition to the stuff that has already been said, the stuff that I said and the stuff that Pasquale and Branislav have just said as regards to cooperation, can I just mention another point? I think we need to acknowledge the link between mobility and fraud. And I think that that there is a lot of discussion in criminology circles about crimes of mobility, and it tends to focus on immigration and so on, trafficking and so on. But I think that tax fraud is a crime of mobility. So in first instance, obviously, mobility of capital. The fact that capital is much more movable makes it much easier to commit fraud. But even if you think about the VAT fraud in terms of even goods, the mobility of goods and the lack of borders is also an issue. So I think that as individual countries acting on fraud, considering how mobile capital and people and goods are, is a flawed approach. So I have to just start this in subscribing to Pasquale and Branislav comments about having a kind of a unit to tackle fraud, a kind of overarching global approach to fraud. I'll just add this. It is necessary if you have a crime of mobility. When you have a crime that is no longer intrinsically a national crime, but it is a crime that is in a global scale, when you can't transfer the profits of tax fraud anywhere in the world, really, you have to tackle it in an integrated global manner. Otherwise, you're not going to get anywhere. And I'll just make this final point before I pass it on to you, Diane. I think that Pasquale just touched upon this issue of if we can do it for BEPS, why can't we do it for tax fraud? I think that that as sexy as the avoidance of multinationals is, I think there is a lot more money in combating tax fraud at a global level. So my first issue for policymakers is this: focus on which the priority should be and what is more likely to bring you benefits. And I think the efforts are often, in terms of policy, are often not what where they should be. Where the likelihood of success on taxing corporations at a global level is much smaller than actually getting many, many millions more through combating fraud at a global level. So, and that's my final point. Back to you.
Great, thank you. I have to say it's fascinating that each of you in your sort of response to that last question touched upon one of the themes I had been eager to sort of get to, but we just had so much going on, which was to what degree is this a problem that really is effectively cross-border, and that cooperation, international cooperation, is going to be critical. And it was quite fascinating to see, even though we didn't raise that explicitly, it was running through each of your responses. So first, thank you all so much for this roundtable portion. I could go on, but I do want to turn to, I think, some of the questions that our audience has. And I'm not surprised because I found it to be a conversation that has my brain going. So what I'm going to do is I will read the first three people we'll be turning to for questions, so you can kind of prepare yourself and know you're up, and ask you just again your name, your affiliation, if you're connected to the VIRTEU project, and then to try to get to your question kind of as quickly as possible. We have a number, and I would love to hear from everybody. So we're turning off the recording now, and we are closing out the roundtable with a brief summation. I'm delighted to introduce Marie Laird. She's a postgraduate researcher at the Center for Fiscal and Corporate Integrity at Coventry University. So Marie, please take it over.
Hi, yes, I'm also a research assistant on the VIRTEU project. So I listened, it was a really, really interesting discussion. Firstly, I'd like to thank all of the panelists, and Costa and Lorenzo, yourself, Professor de La Feria, Professor Pistone, and Dr. Hock for attending today. It was really interesting to see the common themes coming through in all of the discussions with all of you around the issues of definitions and of defining tax fraud, corruption, evasion, and where the boundaries of that would lie, and the interconnections and the overlaps in the definition, particularly between evasion, and tax avoidance, and tax planning and tax fraud, and the influence and the impact of the advice that's given by professionals and how they feed into the schemes and the various actions that are going on. It was also really interesting to see all of the discussion around the multinational element of the issues and how it was a transnational, international issue, and that there is a need for an effective international framework to deal with tax fraud on an international level. And obviously as well, the discussion around crime prevention and the design of legislation and how that can impact on the enforcers and how those enforcers can become almost a part of the problem if the legislation is not properly designed and there's an overlap, or there's an element there where the enforcers can become a part of the problem. It was also interesting in the roundtable discussion to look at the discussion between immorality and illegality, between tax avoidance and tax evasion, and which was brought up by Oliver. And when Stephen brought up the issues around Brexit, obviously, I'm sure you can all hear from my accent, I have a vested interest in the situation with the Northern Ireland Protocol, and it is interesting to hear experts say that we still don't know what's happening and there is no precedent and nobody is sure how it's going to develop. I have myself concerns around how it's going to impact on Northern Ireland and how it is already starting to impact on us here in the province. So that for me was quite really important discussion that needs to be had in the space, and I'm just not sure where it's going to go. And obviously then looking at the common law influence and the relevance of case law in Europe and whether that's going to continue to be persuasive even post-Brexit. And then clearly looking at the scandals in places like Cyprus and around the kind of investor citizenship tax evasion schemes, and Donato's final question. It was a really interesting in-depth discussion, and I would like to thank absolutely everybody who attended. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, just for kind of helping us pull it all together to sort of go away into the evening. So I'm just going to close it out with a reminder of our next roundtable is Friday, February 12th, 2021. So you can find the information on that and join us. And once again, thank you so much to our panelists, Branislav, Rita, and Pasquale. An absolute pleasure to be chatting with you all. Have a great afternoon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.